Hello, ladies and gentlemen and other gentle persons. Welcome to this presentation, the first of two, about the Civil War, total war in the United States. The Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865, but as we've learned, it had been building within the United States for quite some time. So let's get started. So the first thing, whoops, got a little excited. So first thing I want to do is I want to go over a timeline of events. All right, it's important to just have a sense of chronology, right? A sense of, one, two, three, four, right? We're going to also look at the definition of total war, which is really important. Not every war in history is in fact total, but virtually all civil wars are total. So this is important. We need to pay attention to that. We're also going to look at a brief comparison of resources of North versus South. If you want more details on that, please check out my video lessons previous to this one that talk about the buildup to the Civil War and also have individual video lessons on what the North had versus what the South had. But so that we're all on the same page, I want to do a quick review of that here. Also, we're going to look at some battle plans and we're going to look at the results of those battle plans. In part two, I'm going to focus on a more play-by-play of the Civil War and some key battles. So, all right, let's take a look. So you see here, just the dates, right? So we have 1860, which technically the war didn't start at that point, but we need to put it on this timeline because that is the year that the South seceded, right? Or at least South Carolina seceded, the first of several states that would do so. And then you have blockouts for, you have bullets, sorry, I couldn't think of the word, bullets for each year of the war. So let's take a look. Now, just before we get started, let me draw your attention to the key up here at the top right-hand corner. Red indicates wins for the South or things that benefited the South in some way. In this case, it's not a battle, but obviously South Carolina seceding from the Union is not good for the North, right? So it's either a win or it's good for that particular side. So red, wins or good for the South, blue, wins or good for the North, and purple is a draw. There are only a couple of those, but I'll talk about those in a minute. So, okay, 1861, big year. As you can see, this is overall killer for the South, right? The South really takes the cake for 1861. So early in the war, it's not looking good for the Union. It's not looking good at all. The Confederacy is kicking butt and taking names, ladies and gentlemen, all right? So in 1861, you have the secession of the Deep South, and then later on in that year, you have the secession of the Upper South, right? So by the time 1861 ends, you have full secession is in effect. You have the formation of the Confederacy. It's sometimes called the Battle of Fort Sumter, but it's also known as the Siege of Fort Sumter because it wasn't exactly a battle per se, but Southern forces or Confederate forces surrounded Fort Sumter, which was a garrison controlled by the North, and successfully forced their surrender after about 2 weeks of a siege. And then 1861 concludes with the first Battle of Bull Run, which serves as a draw. Both sides sort of happily marched to this battle, like all excited, because you have to understand, humans love a show, all right? We love a show, right? And a battle in a war promises to be a show. Now, people thought on both sides that this was going to be a really quick war. This was not going to be very long. It was going to, each side believed that they would decide the day in a very, winner take all, pomp and circumstance. I'm, the bomb.com sort of vibe, right? The first Battle of Bull Run proved that would not be the case. As people were witnessing it and experiencing it, they realized that this was not going to be an easy win for either side, and both sides experienced massive casualties. All right, that brings us into 1862. So the Union is evening out a bit, but still, there are significant gains for the Confederacy here. So Grant captures Fort Henry and Donelson. Farragut captures New Orleans, right? But McClellan ends up losing Richmond, all right? He made some bad calculations and he lost Richmond. This was key to one of the battle plans, or the key battle plan I'm going to talk about, the Anaconda Plan. Unfortunately, McClellan loses Richmond through some bad decisions. South ends up winning the second Battle of Bull Run. Completely annihilates them. But the Union comes back with a win at the Battle of Antietam. You then have the first Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln thought would serve as more of a blow to the South than it did. And there were not just one, but of course, this was the first Emancipation Proclamation, and it freed slaves in the South, not in the North. All right, so states that didn't secede, that remained with the Union, border states, slavery was unaffected in those states because they did not rebel. Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to seceding slave states. You then have the Battle of Fredericksburg. So the end of 1862 sees the South, the Confederacy, coming back strong, and they end up winning the Battle of Fredericksburg. Now, you start to see things turn in 1863. And by 1864, that turn is complete. And it's basically a death march. So you have in 1863 the final Emancipation Proclamation given by Lincoln. The Battle of Chancellorsville is won by the South. Battle of Gettysburg is a draw. Now, the South ended up withdrawing. So technically, you could call it a win for the North, but both sides took so many casualties, the likes of which neither side had ever seen or experienced. It was incredibly bloody. Incredibly bloody. I cannot begin to overestimate the bloodiness of that particular battle. So we count that as a draw because each side took such heavy casualties. So by the end of 1863, though, the North is looking pretty good, and they take both the Battle of Vicksburg and the Battle of Chattanooga. 1864, Atlanta falls to Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman, and that's so-called the burning of Atlanta, which was particularly brutal, and really, really inhumane. I mean, Sherman really took no prisoners and was indiscriminate in who he killed and who he harmed. You also see Lincoln reelected, and Sherman doesn't just march through Atlanta, he marches through Georgia, burning everything in sight. This would leave a particularly bad taste in the mouth of Southerners, which makes sense. It also is going to complicate Reconstruction post-Civil War. This was unnecessary bloodshed. It was gratuitous. It was violence for the sake of violence, which usually doesn't work out the way people think it's going to work out. And then by 1865, you have the 13th Amendment. Grant captures Petersburg and Richmond. Lee surrenders at Appomattox, or however you like to pronounce that. That is the final battle of the Civil War. Lincoln, of course, is assassinated, and the Confederacy officially surrenders after that last battle. So there's our timeline. Now, do you need to memorize all of this? Of course you don't need to memorize all of this. This is an obscene amount of information. But it's not necessarily about memorization. It's about just understanding the general tenor of the war, the general ebbs and flows. You should memorize that early in the war, the South was supremely successful. You should note that by 1864, the tide had turned in favor of the Union. Those items you should know. Do you need to know everything about every little battle? No, of course not. Besides, there are hundreds of battles I couldn't even include here because it would be ridiculous. But the big trends within the war are things that you should memorize. Okay. All right, so total war, what is that? That involves all aspects, areas of society. Not a single part of society is exempt, remains untouched. Every aspect of society is affected. Political systems, economic systems, natural resources, human resources, and of course, military resources and talents. Everything is affected. Everything. Nothing escapes the touch of the war. That's what total war is all about. You cannot escape it. Doesn't matter who you are or what your station in life, you cannot escape total war when it hits your society. It's also important to note that initially, as we intimated earlier, the South appeared to be in the better position. You'd think, history, or rather people who look at history, have this way of romanticizing what took place. Or if not romanticizing, they're like, well, it was inevitable. The inevitability of everything. And the hard-fought wins and tend to be just glossed over as inevitable, when in fact, very little is in fact inevitable. A lot of wins or events that end up happening hinge on decisions that people don't necessarily realize are that significant at the time. So, and when you're in the middle of it, you can't always see which decisions are going to be that pivotal. Sometimes you can. Sometimes you can recognize, okay, this is a watershed moment, right? But in many cases, you can't. You're too close to it. If you're the one in it and experiencing that history, well, what will become history to somebody else many moons later, you can't see it, right? So the sense that the Union victory was inevitable is erroneous. It's false. It's wrong. Uh, it was not inevitable because initially the South was in a much better position and had certain different decisions been made, not just by American players, but by foreign players, we'd be experiencing a very different United States right now, if we were even experiencing a United States or if we were even around to experience it. The Union victory was by no means inevitable. All right, so let's take a look at what we've got here. So try to move my little camera guy. Well, I'll put it right here for now. Okay, so farming. North had small farms, family labor, livestock, basic crops. There was no slavery, and there was a free soil system, right? Stark contrast to the South, plantations, cash crops, very small number of small farms, and of course, slavery. When you move to industry, you have predominantly factories and not homes. You have fabric and shoe production. The Industrial Revolution played a huge role in Northern development. Again, stark contrast with the South, agriculture, very little industry, although Richmond was an industrial center, so that's going to prove important down the line. In terms of labor, obviously the South, slavery. With the North, you had free labor. There were no slaves. You had women, then immigrants were the predominant labor force, and they were paid hourly wages. You had a large number of cities in the North. They were crowded. There were tons of people, and they were the primary location of factories, which helped to facilitate the industrial development of the North. All right, and then, of course, in the South, you have very few cities, and it's predominantly rural. Transportation, you have canals, rivers, steamboats. South, really, you had your feet, and you had some horses, right? You had a few canals and a few railroads, but very little. So in terms of transportation and being able to resupply their lines, the North was much more successful at this than the South could be. In terms of social organization, and this is where things get important. Well, obviously it's all important, but social organization is key here. The North, the Union, was diversified in terms of its social classes and social hierarchy. The South was not, okay? In the North, you have wealthy, you have working class, you have servants and urban poor, and you also have free blacks. Now, obviously, working class, servants and urban poor, and free blacks outnumbered the wealthy, but the wealthy had a significant, you had significant division and reasonable amounts between the social groups. Whereas in the South, you had like wealthy plantation owners represented like this tiny little percentage and everybody else. So you have a society that's massively stratified with power and wealth controlled by a comparatively small number of people. And that's not a good diversification of resources. That doesn't allow society to function properly. You need a balance between the social classes and also a balance of wealth throughout the society. And the South did not have that. This is going to prove to be important, not just for fighting the war itself, but then for Reconstruction after. Because fundamentally, the South tried to retain what it had. That was not a good move to make. All right, so plans of attack. This is the overview, basic overview here, plans of attack. So North, they're looking at an offensive war, all right? They have to go into the South to defeat it, right? They're going to use their larger population. They're going to use their better resources. They want to take Richmond, and they're going to use this thing called the Anaconda Plan, which I'm going to explain in more detail in the next slide. Now, the South knew that the North was coming for them, right? So they were like, we're going to wage a defensive war. We want to wear out the North. We need to stall, right? If we can wear out the North and turn public sentiment against the war, it could force Lincoln to negotiate a settlement with us, right? So we're going to wear them out. We're going to take advantage of our military leadership, use our knowledge of the terrain, and define the cause as a defense of the homeland, right? If you can shift that propaganda to work for you, defending this cause as defense of the homeland is going to push more people to join the fight, but also to fight harder because they're defending what's theirs, right? If you can convince the rest of Southern society that the North is coming for you personally, then you'll get more buy-in. This would prove to be a very effective tool, not just for recruiting during the war, but for perpetuating this idea of the South as this noble society and this lost cause well after the Civil War. And this is going to have repercussions for Reconstruction and what comes beyond that. You want to control the time and location of battles and seek help from Britain and France if needed. The South would make a massive miscalculation here, as they pretty much assumed that France and Britain would come to their aid if asked. They didn't. So, what's the Anaconda Plan? 3 steps. Step 1, blockade the southern ports. They did that relatively quickly. Yes, successful. Step 2, take control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in 2, right? Which was also successful. Now, step 3, that's going to take time. Now, it was ultimately successful, but they didn't take Richmond until 1865. So they lost a lot of soldiers, a lot of resources, massive loss of life, and gory loss at that in attempting to take Richmond. The South largely successfully defended it until the end of the war. So results of the plans. Initial, like we said, the Union got their butts kicked, right? They had really bad military leadership. It took a really long time to find solid military leadership in the Union because most of those military leaders were Southerners, and they remained loyal to the Confederacy. They massively underestimated Southern military capability, which is a shock to me considering how all of your military leaders were predominantly Southern and they went back to the Confederacy. These are all your professors at West Point that just said, peace out, right? So I'm wondering how on earth people were dumb enough to make that mistake, but hey, what are you going to do? They lack knowledge of the terrain, which they also underestimated what that lack of knowledge would do to them. Both sides did have trouble getting and retaining troops, especially after Bull Run, the first battle, that is. Once word got out that war isn't as romantic as people like to make it out to be, then folks were a lot less excited about signing up. Governors also resisted centralized control of forces. This was a problem in the Confederacy because the Confederacy was organized in a very similar fashion to the Articles of Confederation. States could largely do what they wanted. The president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, could ask for things, but he couldn't mandate, right? And this would prove to be a massive, massive problem for the South, and I would argue one of the primary reasons why they were undone. So, results of the plans a bit later. Both sides did struggle to pay for the war, but the North was in a better position to do so. The South just kept printing money, printing money, which caused massively bad inflation. I mean, a disaster. I mean, you couldn't buy jack squat with these Confederate notes by the time they were done with this printing. And they just boxed themselves into a corner this way. The North was able to float bonds. It did cause some inflation, but it was manageable. And their economy was more diversified, so they had better resources in that way. So economically speaking, the North was much more successful in paying for the war economically. The Confederate economy could not produce the necessary supplies. Again, not diversified. The whole system, the whole institution of slavery formed the backbone, the foundation of their economy. And slavery in wartime doesn't work. It doesn't allow for that versatility that the Northern diversified economy allowed for. And you need to be versatile in war. So the Confederate Army just couldn't keep up. Union was fine on supplies. They really had no problems in that arena. Runaway inflation in the South made these economic problems massively worse and made it that much harder to produce the supplies that they could produce. I make a reference to Weimar Republic, Weimar Germany. That was the government in power, the Weimar Republic. It was a government in power just before Hitler took over, and they had hyperinflation problems as well. It's one of the reasons why Hitler was able to step in and so seemingly easily take power. Things got that bad. So Union was okay because of a strong economy, and by early 1863, you see the tide start to turn in favor of the Union. This turn would be complete by 1864, and at that point, the South is just sort of treading water, but they're not swimming anymore. That is the end of part 1, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in part 2.